As is our custom here, our guest will have a few remarks, and then it will be Q&A with reporters, and this event is on the record. I did ask Governor Little how he would like to be introduced, and he said, how about here's Brad from Emmett? So here's Brad from Emmett.
Well, good morning. Yeah, you didn't tell me about that on the record part. I thought that would. So that changes everything. Well, first off, thanks, and we're about what day? What legislative day are we? 536. Oh, anyway, and I've signed 5 bills. And I didn't have any bills in my bill box when I left last night. There might be a few new ones, but obviously the points that I made in my State of the State, which I know you all memorized, the big things that is pending right now are all education, particularly our launch proposal. And I think I had 2 meetings yesterday about it, and we're working through the process. It's obviously across one side, and it's over in the Senate, and we're cautiously optimistic, but we're having robust discussions with our Senate friends about what's going to take place there. And then, as those of you are aware, both the Lieutenant Governor and I have been around the state talking about the launch issue. Last week we went to Swan Falls, Rigby, and Twin, and a couple of Rigby, a lot of those kids you could tell were probably going to go on to traditional higher education, but in Twin, it was an aggregated Twin Falls schools, career technical, HVAC, plumbing, electrical, and when I first asked the question, how many of them are going to go on to get their associate's or bachelor's degree, only one student raised their hand. And when I explained all the different components of launch and how much more affordable and accessible going on was going to be, every student raised their hand. So that to me is prima facie evidence that this is going to work. I was at the governor's conference in Washington a week and a half ago, and I actually chaired a panel of the national governors about workforce, and I wasn't one of the panel members. I was just the facilitator, but I talked about our launch program, and I had governors and people interested in this, really interested in how this is going to go. So I'm hopeful that we're going to be successful. I think it's going to transform opportunities, and one of the big things is going to make it more affordable. You take $8,500 off the cost of a bachelor's, an associate, or career technical training. It just significantly broadens the number of kids that's going to be available to. So, in case you didn't know, that's a very high priority for me. Obviously, our teacher compensation package, there's discussions about that. I understand the JFAC's going to set the K-12 bill last, so it's going to be a while before we get to that point. I think the insurance add-on, I think the certified staff, or classified staff, that will, I think we're going to be successful there, but so much of my initiatives are going to be wrapped up in the very last, the appropriation process. And the appropriation process it was started off a little slow, but they're doing pretty well now. We're getting them out, but they had kind of a slow start, but they seem to be catching back up. So obviously, probably the public safety aspect of it. Many of you have written about fentanyl. I hear about it everywhere I go, about the magnitude of it, and it's hard to imagine that a year and a half ago fentanyl wasn't near the issue it is today. And when you ask what's changed, it's the capability of the organized crime, almost all in Mexico, taking fentanyl and putting it into an affordable, accessible pill form, and that's what's really exacerbated the problem. So whether it's what we do on the law enforcement side, what we do on basically pre-prosecution diversion grants, what we do in our information awareness. I'd be interested in your take on how that is. I'm a little concerned when I go talk to students and they haven't seen fentanyltakesall.org or not just once. What is it, Madison?
All it takes.
All it takes. We went back and forth on what it was going to be, so I can't remember what version it was, but that is a big deal to the people of Idaho, and there's still a lot of people that aren't aware of the magnitude of it. But if you're in law enforcement, you're darn sure aware of it, and it all goes back to my number one goal I talked about when I first got this job of creating the best possible atmosphere for our kids to want to stay here, and they want a good job, and we got lots of those. They want a good education for themselves and for their kids. We're working on that, but they want to be safe, and so having safe streets, it's really important that we do all we can to resolve some of these challenges that we've got from this just onslaught. But every state's facing it, and it's interesting. Some of these rural communities are even suffering more from it than what you would think would be the more likely areas. So I suppose I was supposed to say something else, Madison, but I forgot it. So I'll try and take some questions, Betsy.
Well, if I may, I'd like to ask the first question.
Oh, you always get the...
So, Governor, so far this legislative session, there's been a whole lot of legislation introduced, and much of it seems to be passing, that has nothing to do with those priorities that you've outlined and that you talked about in your State of the State message, on topics like censoring and banning books from schools and libraries, criminalizing various forms of health care, and diverting millions and millions from the public school budget for payments to families that choose to homeschool or send their kids to private schools. In the past, when legislation that didn't fit your priorities or that was clearly flawed reached your desk, you have written transmittal letters pointing out the flaws, but you have signed it into law anyway, rather than exercising your veto prerogative. Will you treat these bills differently this year?
Well, you never give me credit for the ones I actually did veto. You just remember the ones that I wrote transmittal letters. And, I would argue, matter of fact, I was looking, a bill that I vetoed, I won't say what it was, last year. I was looking at my veto letter, and it was right next to the transmittal letters, because, unless I write it and I get all the legislators, there is no perfect legislation. So, transmittal letters are where I say, I think this is going to be a problem. And I've been accurate in some of the areas where I've said there's going to be a problem. And in fact, they've said, oh yeah, we're going to come back and fix it. And they haven't exactly done it. I would also add that at the early on session is the time that legislators can introduce personal bills, which don't have the effect of a committee bill that always goes further. Personal bills, there's probably one in 100 that makes it across the finish line. And some of those bills you talked about were personal bills. And anybody can introduce a personal bill. The question is, will the chairman give them a hearing, or will they be referred to the shredder?
But some of those bills have actually cleared committee.
I'm aware of that, but they've still got to, in our bicameral process, they've got to, and generally, when they pass the first body, the second body is always sitting there saying, we want to find the mistakes and the errors in the second body. So, I'll be patient and wait for them. There's validity to your statement, but often that happens early. And I also am concerned about some of the big things that they may not get to. You know, property taxes, which I earmarked $120 million for property taxes. There's a lot of talk going about that, but as you all know, tax bills usually end up, unless it was last year, where it was the first bill of the session, they usually end up at the end of the session, and that's not abnormal. But the answer to your question is I got to see the legislation after it passes both bodies, and I got to see how it comports. One of the authors was talking, well, I was listening to some of the debate yesterday. A lot of these issues are issues that concern Idahoans that are happening in other states that aren't very applicable here. And even the sponsors admit that. We're building a moat around Idaho so these things don't show up here in Idaho. And perhaps even when I was in the legislature, I might have been guilty of voting for some of those moat bills for something that wasn't even going to come into Idaho, but it's a statement. You know, I'll look at each piece of legislation on its merits and, you know, what I think is best for the people of Idaho. So, will I write some more transmittal letters that look like a veto letter? Yes.
Oh, really? Okay. I believe Jimmy had a question.
Well, given that, I mean, would you call those mode issues distractions from, I mean, your priorities, but also the priorities that we see, you know, year after year in the Boise State survey and the polling that was done by the Idaho Statesman last year?
Well, it depends how you classify it as a distraction. I mean, people feel passionate about these, but you know, your reference to the Boise State survey, obviously, education is education jobs, which is what 80% of my State of the State was about, is the number one priority for the people of the state of Idaho. But they are concerned. You know, Idaho's growth in the last 15 years have been a lot of people coming from other states where they have significant political differences with the direction those states are coming. So it doesn't shock me that it's a big issue here in Idaho. But will they change things dramatically? I don't know. I think most of the things they're talking about there are not issues, but they're important to people, and I can appreciate that. So.
Jimmy, did you have a follow-up?
I'm good for it.
Okay. Next is Ryan, and you're next.
Governor, you got a faction in the legislature that wants to take private school money, public school money, and give it to private school students. Why aren't Republicans on the same page when it comes to education?
Well, again, a lot of this movement is generated in other states and nationwide. I was very fortunate to be selected as a Hunt Keene Fellow and studied education policy all over the United States. And I went to charter schools in Denver, Memphis, I think Baltimore. And charter schools in other states and choice in other states is vastly different from what it is here. You know, I think the Heritage Foundation ranks us third for education choice in Idaho because we have magnet schools, we have charter schools, we have homeschooling, we've got other alternative schools that are available. And in some of these other areas, these kids are stuck in their own geographic area. They can't get out. These failing urban core schools that exist is where a lot of the interest in charter schools. So on a national level, a lot of my fellow governors, but they have laws in their states that aren't anywhere like we have, where parents have choice to move their kids out of whatever school whatever brick and mortar and personnel school they're in, into another school with more options. So I think that discussion is going to take place. I have said consistently that anything that's significantly detrimental to the long-term funding of public schools, I'm going to have an issue with. So if it's And I know there's a story about what the ESA bill, what it'll cost, and it takes a little while to crunch those numbers, and then look at, as always in legislation, look at the unintended consequences of it. We have incredible choice options in Idaho. I think the charter school first bill started just a year or so before I got in the legislature, and I think I've supported every one of them. So I've got a great record on choice, but there comes some point in time, particularly in a state where our per pupil funding is as low as it is, that it's different in Washington, D.C., where they spend $15,000 a student than it is here in Idaho, where we pay $6,000.
Question right here.
All right, so the House passed House Bill 124 earlier this week, and one aspect of this bill stipulates that student IDs could no longer be used as a valid form of voter ID for elections in the state. And so this bill, sitting on the Senate State Affairs Committee, if the bill, was passed in the Senate and made it to your desk, my first question is, would you sign it? Why or why not? And then a second sort of follow-up: are there any benefits to students, that are going to college in Idaho? Is there a benefit for them to vote in the state, or and are there any drawbacks?
Well, it ought to be easy to vote and hard to cheat. That's my old Ben Usursa-ism that I'll insert at this point in time. But and I think Ruth's interview with Phil McGrain and talked about, if we don't have student IDs, do we have a easy and available alternative? Which I understand the Idaho Transportation Department is talking about an alternative. Because what do you say, 150? 104. There were only 104 votes where it was student. I thought it'd be a lot bigger than that, because I know so many college kids that come here from out of state that don't have a car, and but there are other reasons to have a driver's license or an ID. So I'll have to see all the unintended consequences. But if we can come up with an alternative, because if you show up at Emmett with a student ID, you got to do a lot of educate. We should make it easy for poll workers to identify, have a common identifier for people to vote.
Do you have a follow-up?
I guess one follow-up is, what would you suggest, as a student, I know a lot of student coworkers and colleagues and those I interact with don't vote. What advice would you give, to students, who are hesitant to vote?
Well, I tell this to my friends all the time. In politics and in political discourse, if you're not at the table, there's a chance you're on the menu, and they better get at the table.
Next question's from Scott.
I wanted to ask about Idaho Launch, your favorite subject.
I'm all in. How much time we got?
Perhaps. How do you respond to the criticisms that this is a redistribution of wealth, use of government money to pay for the training that should be paid for by businesses, in particular businesses that may be contributing to your campaign? This is some sort of payoff to you.
There's, even at $8,500, there's not, that will not take care of it. Businesses are going to have to contribute staff. Our most in-demand job right now is healthcare, and larger healthcare facilities are going to have to provide their medical staff to be part of the training. They're going to have to provide equipment in the welding and the advanced manufacturing. There are going to have to be all kinds of contributions, and for the most part, they're never going to get there you're not going to get those programs done unless the businesses are going to benefit from that workforce, put some skin in the game. And the students, $4,250 a year will not get you, I don't think, anything that will meet the demands of the Workforce Development Council to be certified. I can't remember what the language is in the bill. So there's 36 people on the Workforce Development Council. They're from all different industries. They're from all different parts of the state. No one business has, there might be 2 healthcare people on there, but that's 1/18. So it is going to have to be a collective agreement by the Workforce Development Council on what's going to be best for all the workforce in the state. And it's different. You know, in North Idaho, obviously, jobs in the timber industry are important. In Southeast Idaho, it's food processing. All over the state, it's healthcare. In Eastern Idaho, it's nuclear engineering. So tailoring workforce development for the local jobs is what's going to be important. But this goes back to what I said earlier, Scott. Everybody has complained about the increase in tuition and fees. This is the one biggest action by the state to make post K-12 training available to the vast majority of Idaho. Our goal is 60% to go on. I take issue with the fact that that only means an associate or a bachelor's degree, that we need to have more of those good career technical in that 60%, but we're down to less than 40 right now. So we got a lot of runway to get there, and we're gonna have to build capacity. Training in nurses is probably, well, the state board has already said that's their number one priority, is what do we do to get the nurses? So this addresses the affordability thing. You know, they beat up the college president's state board about increasing fees and tuition, as they should. This is going to fix that problem.
And a quick follow-up. Given the fact that this has struggled a little bit in the legislature, is there any sort of horse trading going on, perhaps with ESA proposals?
There is always horse trading. That's all I'll say.
Governor, you mentioned things you hope the legislature gets to. What do you think the biggest topic out there is that they're not talking about, or maybe won't touch on this session?
Well, I think there'll be later. Obviously, my teacher compensation, because of when the Joint Committee is going to set the education budget, and there's conversations, and the vast majority of my initiatives are budget driven, and that's why I think it's a little bit of a distraction that all these personal bills, and that a lot of that, but a lot of them were presented during the hearing process, the hearing process. But now that they've rolled up their sleeves and started to set budgets, then I think that I think it will come to the surface. Obviously, property taxes, there's 4 or 5 different property tax proposals out there. Basically, I said, here's $120 million. We look at the budget for 5 years, and this is sustainable, and it's a tax shift. It basically taking $120 million off of everybody's property tax and putting it onto everybody's sales tax and income tax. It's not, there's no magic to property taxes. You either shift it to another taxpayer or you shift it to sales tax and income tax.
So on property tax, do you think there's something the legislature could really do that'll make a difference for Idahoans?
Oh, there's good proposals out there, but the problem with property taxes is every single taxing district's different. Every single area is different. A resort area where you've got high value homes that don't get the homeowner's exemption. A place where there's a lot of rental units where any kind of a homeowner's shift goes on to the cost of rent. A place where you got a lot of commercial and retail like we do here. A place where it's a lot of ag ground. So generally what happens, and I probably plead guilty when I was in the legislature, like-minded legislators from like areas get together and says, we've fixed the problem. Well, then you run the spreadsheet about how it affects all the other legislators and taxpayers and districts, and then all of a sudden the brakes get thrown on. But it's easy for people in common areas to get together and says, we'll fix the problem. But that's the complication of property tax. You know, we funded this state on only property tax and alcohol tax until we started income tax. Then in 1965 we started sales tax. So.
Ruth, and then Ryan, and then Jim.
Hi, Governor. Thanks for taking the time to do this. I'm going to go back to Idaho Launch. As you know, it narrowly passed the House. The Senate hasn't taken it up yet. Should Idaho Launch not pass, what happens to that $800,000 that was allocated for in-demand career?
80 million.
What did I say?
Go ahead. I would never correct the press.
Just a decimal.
800,000? Whatever it was.
80 million.
That's embarrassing. Idaho Launch, what happens?
That's a
to
good question.
Funding and
But-
I know in-demand careers was a focus of yours.
Well, both the 330 and the 80 was passed in the along with the tax bill in the special session, and it was basically not all the specificity of it, but the general question was put before the voters, and 4 out of 5 voters voted for it. And so, but you know, it's just legislation. It's not in the Constitution. There's nothing to say the legislature can't say, well, the old legislature put $410 million into education. We're not going to do any of it. Now, I think the optics of that are really, really bad. But the answer to your question is, who knows? Because in essence, 80 was dedicated for post K-12, and 330 was for K-12. That's the diversion of sales tax that goes into those two funds. The legislature would have to unwrap that diversion if they wanted to do anything else with it.
Governor, we have some new JFAC chairs. Speaker Moyle's making some changes on the budget setting committee. How has your office interacted with the new committee so far, and are you concerned about your agencies getting the money they need this year?
Always, I'm always concerned about that. But I've had multiple meetings. Obviously, my budget director's down there every day answering questions. We've got a good relationship. I guess full disclosure, the first proposal of having the two committees be totally separate. I started my first ever political when I was an intern in college at JFAC in 1976. I've got the budget book right next to my desk from 1976. And John Andresen came up to the University of Idaho in my state and local government, the only political science class I ever took, and recruited me. And of course, John was very prominent in a lot of the rules and the protocols for the joint committee, and many states have adopted our model. So anything that significantly disrupted that, you better look at the unintended consequences. Under the current system, the whole committee has ownership in those bills when they get to the floor. So generally they'll pick one member. One member will be the sponsor of the appropriation bill, but the chairman and the co-chairman are there to back them up. You see it happen all the time. If it was a Senate bill going to the House or a House bill going to the Senate, that wouldn't happen. And if that would have been the case, don't make any June plans.
Oh my gosh. Laura, no, I'm sorry, Jimmy, then Laura, then Christine.
Governor, back to Idaho Launch. You mentioned at the beginning that you had had a couple meetings about it. I think it was yesterday. Could you kind of describe any sort of hesitancy from the Senate, or what their concerns are, and if they're trying to bring amendments to it?
What? No, it's. I mean, this is a transformative way of funding post K-12. always before, and those of you, I won't name names, Betsy, that have been around the Joint Committee for a long, long time, know that it was kind of a slugfest, giving money to one institution over another institution over another institution, decision units here, decision units there. The state board recognized that. If you were an institution that got your way and got the money, that was great, but it wasn't driven by jobs, it wasn't driven by demand, and it wasn't driven by students. This turns that on its head and is driven by students and the demand in healthcare jobs, the demand in cybersecurity jobs, the demand in education jobs. So it's a total transformation. So whenever you take something that's been around for a long time and transform it, you've got a higher hurdle, and that's what we're, there was some of the debate in the House that I did not agree with. I didn't think it was accurate. I think it was a possible perception issue. I think we're going to be okay, but it's a big change.
Do you think, I mean, based on that, do you think it's an issue of lawmakers not wanting to give up control over those?
Oh, I would never say that.
Laura has the next question.
You talked about how healthcare jobs are some of the most in demand in the state. Some of the bills that have come through, their opponents have argued that they disincentivize healthcare providers from coming to Idaho because they penalize certain types of healthcare. Is that a concern of yours, that people would want to come here to practice?
Well, I was actually here in this room with the basically the advocates for health education for all the jobs that we do in health education, and I know they've got concern about it, but that is a part of it. But the bigger part of it is we're the fastest growing state, and we've got a lot of elderly people, and COVID was so disruptive. Paying traveling nurses $300 an hour and $400 an hour, and given the conditions they were working in, there were a lot of those people that were kind of getting to the end of their career. Obviously, being paid $300 or $400 an hour was a motivator for them to stay there for a while, but they retired. We've got just this huge demand, and then we're trying to scale it out to our rural hospitals. There's a lot of disruption on Medicaid because of the federal rules that were there, and there's going to be people that are Medicaid reimbursements being, significantly debated. So there's just a lot of disruption, and we just need more workforce there in every way, shape, and form. So.
Laura, do you have a follow-up?
Yeah, you talked about Medicaid. Are you worried about Medicaid expansion?
A little. It's the law of the land right now. I would add that some of the discussions have been taking place recently. Idaho, I think, if they're not first, they're top 3 states for getting the work done to comply with the new federal law about those people that are not going to be qualified for Medicaid. And in fact, we need everybody in this room's help to make people aware of the fact that if they're on Medicaid, they need to make sure that they're going to be able to continue on Medicaid, and if they're not, that they need to look at our exchange, which is the best exchange in the United States, and probably the best run exchange in the United States, or other healthcare options. So I'm just concerned about the disruption, and that exacerbates my healthcare labor shortage.
Christina?
Yesterday, the House State Affairs Committee considered a bill that would essentially eliminate on-demand absentee ballot, or that avenue of voting. Do you support putting stipulations on people who can request an absentee ballot, or would you consider vetoing that particular bill?
Well, you used to have to say, I need an absentee ballot because I'm going to be gone, or I know I'm going to have surgery, or fill in the blank. That was the standard. I don't know how many years ago did they bring it up in the bill, in the hearing, but that was the standard. we have some precincts in Idaho where it's all absentee voting right now. And in fact, when I was at the governor's conference, I was talking to Governor Gordon in Wyoming. He's got the same proposal over there, but they've got like 20 counties in Wyoming where all the voting's by absentee. They can't get poll workers. So I understand the concern. I think, again, Ruth's interview with Phil McGrain, and I am very thankful that I proposed the election audit 2 years ago. And we've gone through 2 audits. I think we've found 2 votes out of 2 random audits. You can't argue that the way that we do those audits, granted we don't audit all of them, is probably the most sophisticated and fair way to judge the fairness of our election. People need to have confidence in elections. It's essential for this country that people vote. I think, matter of fact, yesterday I applied for my absentee ballot for a school levy election in Emmett. So I look forward to the debate, but I think absentee voting is particularly in rural Idaho, is so important that I'm not all that excited about it.
Scott has the next question, then you, then you.
I don't think this was part of your state of the state or even part of your budget, but I understand there's a proposal to spend $100 million in expanding the state parks system. Is that?
Well, I don't think it's all. I don't think it's expansion. I think a lot of it's maintenance. You know, well, I know a lot of it is maintenance, and then there's some other things that we're doing in parks. But we do expand some parks a little bit. I know there's a robust discussion about Ponderosa Park because of what we went through with the state lands that are up there, and looking at some of those lands. But there's no great big new parks. We're just trying to build capacity, more boat ramps, more parking, more. So we're trying to build capacity because, you know, COVID just exposed a lot of people to the great outdoors of Idaho, and anything we can do there takes pressure off of a lot of our other public and private lands. So we're trying to just maximize capacity at our existing parks. There'll be some minor expansions, but we better take care of what we got before we build some new parks.
You have the next question.
Hi, Governor. There is a bill in the Senate introduced that would grant drug driving authority for unauthorized immigrants. What are your thoughts on this?
Well, it's been around for a long time. Matter of fact, George Norris was the sheriff at Canyon County when I was in the legislature. So this is not a new, and you know, the devil's in the details about what, you know, the people don't want it to be a document you'd use for voting. People don't want to use it as a, I know it's, I think it was Senator Guthrie introduced it, and I haven't seen the latest one, so I'd have to see it and see what the intended or unintended consequences of it is. I do know that a lot of our courts are, in essence, have a lot of their capacity because of citations for not having insurance and not having a driver's license. And I know that Senator Guthrie's issue is people that are driving without insurance and then leave the scene of an accident because of the, there's good arguments on both sides.
Did you have a follow-up?
So you mentioned how Idaho is one of the fastest growing states in the country right now.
Don't tell anybody.
And so over the last few years, the Greater Idaho movement, you know, has been gaining more and more traction here in industry. And so even though, you know, you as a governor, you don't really have a say in whether that, you know, really gets any headway, whether the state line is moved or not. What benefits or strengths do you think, you know, taking in some of the population from Eastern Oregon, you know, would have to the state, either economically or culturally?
Well, the constitutional process to move a state line I think the last time it was done was in the early 50s or 40s, and it was just a minor adjustment. This would be a huge adjustment. It's got to pass both legislature, it's got to pass Congress, and of course one of the things it's going to do is change the electoral. There's going to be electoral votes that were blue that are going to be red under almost every scenario. So it's got a long way to go, but I fully understand because we had Capital for a Day in Bruno last Friday, and some of my friends from Jordan Valley were there, and they're more than excited to be part of Idaho, and I understand that, but it's got a long way to go. So.
Do you have a follow-up?
I guess like in the event that the state boundary was moved, you know, like what is your support or non-support for religious in general? Like what would you say? If you have to describe your position, you know, one or two sentences, what would you say?
It's like all these other things. First thing that's going to happen is unless we amend the Constitution, the size of a legislative district is going to go to 70 or 80,000. And the people that live in big districts and represent big districts complain about, people in Idaho are used to having access to their legislators. This is going to reduce the access to the legislators unless we amend the Constitution.
Okay, Joe has the next question, and then you'll be after him.
Governor, on the change in employee compensation, you had recommended in your budget a 4% merit increase for all state employees and then an additional 6% raise for state law enforcement. I know there's been concerns about staffing and payment for our frontline law enforcement officers. A week ago today, JFAC went a different direction. Do you have major concerns about funding frontline law enforcement, or do you think this will work itself out?
Well, I hope it works itself out. Yes, I have concerns, and I hope it works itself out. We have been, Director Wolf has been making the case, and before that, Director Buxton about, the plan that we used to compensate state employees was literally being talked about when I was an intern in 1976, the Hay Plan. And obviously, modern HR, human resources, you've got to be adaptable to the reality in the marketplace out there. And public safety, my state police, my corrections officers, counties, cities, and other states just pay significantly more, and we ought to reward them for the risks they take. And so I'm not backing down from my strong advocacy for making the law enforcement pay more competitive. So I hope it works its way out. Now they can, as they take up those budgets, they can say, well, we're going to add pay to this group, or we're going to take pay from over here. That's not a great way. There's a reason to have an overarching plan. In fact, the legislature said we need a plan. They said you need to do a study. Here's $1 million plus to do the study. We did the study, and then they didn't necessarily take the advice.
So what message does that send to you that you have this one?
Hope springs eternal. We'll keep working on it.
Next question is right here in the front row.
Mr. Governor, as you referenced earlier, fentanyl deaths have doubled in recent years here in Idaho. What do you think state and state legislature need to do in order to combat this better?
Well, obviously, the magnitude of the problem, it just, like I said, it's in the last 18 months. And so a year ago, I knew, and I actually have been watching fentanyl for quite a while, but the big change was when they started taking fentanyl mainly from China, going to Mexico, blending and putting it in pills, which made it affordable and accessible and safer to transport. So obviously, I think we need to do all three things. We need to beef up our law enforcement, which goes to Joe's question. I've got a decision unit for a drug interdiction team specifically at state police. We need to do everything we can on an awareness to to mainly in the younger population, but to everybody about the risk of fentanyl. And then we need to do everything from pre-prosecution diversion, which our very first Esto Perpetua meeting in Coeur d'Alene, the Coeur d'Alene chief of police said, you know, a first-time arrest for fentanyl with somebody that basically doesn't have an addiction problem yet, but they will have if we don't do something. So we made, the Department of Corrections made $1 million available in pre-prosecution diversion programs. I think Idaho Falls or Bonneville County was the first applicant, and so they can find these people, and instead of putting them in jail, put them in programs. Then we've got our crisis centers, then we've got our recovery centers, then we've got other things we can do to treat it. So it's treatment, diversion, education, and law enforcement. So I'll probably need, you know, when our behavioral health decision units get up there, there's some of those in there, and the Behavioral Health Council is keenly aware of the problem. We gave the Kathy Garrett Award yesterday in my office to Lee Flynn, who runs our 988 program over there. And, you know, suicide and substance abuse and behavioral health are all tied together. And we're very blessed to have a 3-branch behavioral health council that's given us good advice and counsel. But I'm going to need some money and need support also.
Do you have a follow-up? Okay, Audrey has the next question, then you, then Scott, then Ryan, and if anyone else has a question, waggle a finger at me. Okay.
You need a pencil?
Thank you, Governor. So at the very beginning of our talk today, you said you were describing bills that legislature may pass that might only apply to a few different situations or even never come into Idaho. They're a statement. It's a statement that they're making. And I want to go back to the issue that Laura raised with healthcare. So, for example, the bill to criminalize gender-affirming care for trans youth. When healthcare providers see something like that come up, it sends a message to them that the legislature is making decisions about how they treat patients. So you described some other things that are really disruptive to Idaho's healthcare workforce, nurse pay, the aging workforce, retirements, but those things aren't coming across your desk. This bill may. So if it does, what message do you want to send?
Well, the pay bills, those are all appropriation bills that we're just not there yet. So whether it's launch grants to educate or pay, how we do compensation and reimbursement, those are coming. I know that legislation, and I will readily admit I don't spend a lot of time on those things when they first come out, because a lot of times they change. But it, you know, the surgery part of it, you know, what age, those are all factors we'll look at. I understand that. So I've just got to see the bill when it gets there. But I think most, obviously, I don't think Idaho's going to be a bastion for people that want to have significant surgery, particularly for our children.
Yeah, youth transition surgery is not happening, period.
That goes back to my point. Sometimes we pass legislation that is not necessarily applicable to Idaho.
Right, but it sends a statement. So when this
That's
bill,
exactly
if,
right.
If this bill comes across your desk, what statement do you want to send it?
Well, I'd have to look at it. It does send a statement, but that's I mean, that's what they said. That's what the authors say. And like I said, it's in my state of the state. I thought we have an obligation to get the big things done, but it's early in the process.
Yeah, thank you. There's a bill that's really controversial right now about prohibiting K-12 students from entering into bathrooms that aren't.
From students from doing what?
It would prohibit students
Oh, okay.
schools that doesn't match the biological sex. My question for you is, do you think this is something the state should take a hold of, or do you think it should stay in the school districts?
I mean, our system, for better or for worse, is a balance of local control for cities, counties, school boards, fill in the blank, and the state. And in fact, sometimes it's federal government. Generally, my position is they should be, those decisions should be made closest to the people. But there are instances where guidance is given from the state. That is a gray line that moves dependent upon where you are on an issue. I think this is one of those. I don't think I don't think it's a problem. I think a lot of school districts, even without a policy, accommodate them. But I don't think, and I know that most people don't think that boys ought to be going into the girls' bathroom based on something that's a little hard to prove. So.
Scott, then Ryan, then Laura, then Jim.
What's the status of Idaho prisoners who are living out of state, and what are you doing to bring them back into Idaho?
Actually, the appropriation was last year to build a new women's prison. We build a new women's prison. That's going to give us the capacity to move the women out of the current incarceration sites they're in, and we'll bring those out-of-state prisoners back. And it'll be out-of-state, and then it'll be the county jails will be next. And of course, all the things we're doing on behavioral health and diversion, we're trying to keep the inflow in our corrections, and that's why fentanyl is such a big problem. Obviously, traffickers we want to have incarcerated, and there's a lot of discussion going on about that, about the pipeline going into our correction system. But there's a pipeline going in, which there's a lot of factors there, but there's also the programs we have in corrections to where when they get out, they don't come right back in, but it'll be out of state, and then it'll be jails. When I meet with the counties, a few of the jails say, we got too many prisoners. And then I go, now, if we take all the prisoners out of county jails, you're paying for those jails with a check from the state. You're not going to come back to me and say, we want the prisoners back, are you? And they will. But our goal, the Department of Correction, the board, is that if they're incarcerated for any length of time, we want to have programs in county jails so that we can reduce the recidivism rate. So.
Is there a timeline for bringing them?
Oh well, Director T. Walt, I think the board is entertaining the RFP for building the new prison right away. The money's appropriated to build the new women's prison, but as everything everywhere, the supply chain and the cost has gone up. But we are on task to build a new women's prison, which is going to give us the capacity to bring those prisoners back.
This year, next year?
I don't think this year. I don't think it'll be completed this year. It'll probably be next year.
Governor, the Attorney General has a bill that would allow capital punishment by firing squad, which obviously involves you. Would you be willing to execute someone by firing squad?
Well, and I haven't seen the bill. I've seen a lot of what you've written about it, but I haven't seen the bill. But of course, I think it's only in lieu of our current system not working, and I haven't given up on our current system. And I think there's 4 or 5 states that have that as one of the options right now. But I'm a proponent for capital punishment, but we need to do it in the most dignified and humane manner that creates the least amount of stress with my corrections team.
Laura?
Yeah, one of the bills that has passed the House so far would eliminate J-Law. It included some changes to OP. Is that something that you've been tracking, or you?
No, that's I try and stay in my lane, and that's not my lane. But yesterday or day before, we had Foster Care Awareness Day, and in fact, some of the recommendations from JLOC were where we made some really good improvements in our foster care. So there is utility to those reports. Some of them I don't totally agree with, but that's out of my lane. JLOC is.
Nevertheless, it's a bill government that will be coming to you to eliminate JLOC.
Well, I'll see it when he gets there. So.
Jim.
Laura stole my question. But I mean, more specifically, the details about that bill, not only would it eliminate JLOC, but it would limit the scope and what OB could actually assess if it were under legislative council. Do you think that using those resources in that way as prescribed under the bill is a good use of resources?
Like I said, that is all of that's in the legislative branch, and I'd have to see the. I do know from my experiences as both lieutenant governor and governor that, and I don't think it's been as big a problem recently, that occasionally the scope, the JLOC, the legislators would say we need to study this, and then there'd be a lot of increase in the scope, but that's, like I said, that's a legislative issue. I'll look at the pros and cons when he gets to my desk, but I mean, it's really a legislative issue.
We've got 3 more questions in less than 5 minutes, so let's make it snappy. Christina.
Okay. There's a bill before the Senate floor that would add requirements to the initiative process, and it's very similar to a bill that you vetoed in previous legislative sessions. I wonder if you can talk about the role that the initiative process plays in our state and democracy, and if you would support adding restrictions to the initiative process, or if you would consider.
I'll go back to the very first question from our esteemed moderator. I vetoed a bill, and then I signed a bill with conditions on it in that area. And I think the conditions that I put on the one that I signed is that as technology changes, signature gathering technology changes, the hurdle ought to be the same. It shouldn't be worse, it shouldn't be better. But now where a paid petition gatherer can show up with an iPad and know what district you and Laura are in and which one they needed that technology is improved. I think it requires all 35 districts. Is it 6% all 35 districts? That's a stretch for me because
In 60 days.
Yeah.
Like the time is.
Yeah.
Is
But I you go back and look at my transmittal letter. One of the ones that Betsy was critical of, it looked like a veto list.
Critical? Me? Joe?
Yesterday, there was legislation that passed in the Idaho House that basically says, in short, that if any of the 20 state agencies want to sponsor or donate to a private event, you have to sign off on that. Are you familiar with this legislation, and do you think this is necessary to have you signing off in health and welfare as part of the event?
Not real familiar. I'd have to look at it. I don't know that the state needs to be promoting youth drag events, but that's just Brad from Emmett. But I also think Brad from all the other cities probably tend to agree with me, but you got to look at the consequences of it. It was Project Filter that did it, which is actually a legislative committee that takes tobacco settlement money and tries to reduce. But I think they need to be careful about what they're sponsoring.
So do you think you should be the one to sign off on those things?
Oh, I kind of got a day job right now.
Well, Governor Aaron Resby of the Idaho Press recently reported, based on public records, that it was your office that ordered Health and Welfare to drop its sponsorship of the Pride Fest. Why did you do that?
Well, I mean, there was a couple of them, but nobody ever did the records request on me being not very excited about Health and Welfare sponsoring the third shoot at the Snake River Stampede Rodeo. I just don't know that having Health and Welfare's name on any kind of promotion is is a message that we're prudently spending the state's money. So there was a lot of angst about that issue, but nobody, when we said, I don't think health and welfare ought to be sponsoring the rodeo.
So did you withdraw sponsorship?
We sent the message that we didn't think it was the right thing to do. So.
We have only 2 minutes left, and the final question is from you, right here in the front.
Okay, well, I will quickly. So, on Monday, Representative Marjorie Taylor Greene tweeted that, we need a national divorce, and that we need to separate by red states and blue states. So I guess my question is, what are you and your administration doing to work with Democrats in the House and Senate, on some of their policies, and do you think more can be done?
Always. I mean, a good political dialogue with a healthy journalistic review of it is always a good thing. People need to work together to get things done. There's a few things that Marjorie Taylor Greene has said that I probably haven't agreed with over the years, but I think if what you said, if I got it right, people ought to work together. I agree. So.
Okay. Governor, thank you so much.
Thanks,
for taking the
Betsy.
time to talk